Prologue, concerning Hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages the reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westermarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large and called by him there and back again, since they told of his journey into the east and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good tiled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movement. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. For they are little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say. On ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Pandavras Tuk, Bull Roarer, son of Isumbras III, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbits records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were merely folk. They dressed in bright colours, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only crafts little practised among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skillful fingers and could make many more other useful and commonly things. Their faces were, as a rule, good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat, and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times and of 6 meals a day when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties and in presents, which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangements, hobbits are relative of ours. far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, and after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of Hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of their vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. Of the original home the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times in distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear, nonetheless, from these legends, that from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that, like many other folk, hobbits had, in the distant past, moved westward. Their earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of green woods, the great and misty mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the lands, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Hardfoots, Stores, and Fellowhides. The Hardfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stores were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fellowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. The hobbits had much to do with dwarves in ancient times and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westwards early and roamed over Eriador as far as Weatherthorpe, while the others were still in Walderland. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbits, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habits of living in tunnels and holes. The Stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Hardfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there were many of them long dwelt between Tharbards and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Fellowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts. And of all, they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador, they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains amongst clans of Hardfoots or Stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Followhider strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. And the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westernesse. But they were dwindling fast, and the lands of the North Kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was a room to spare for the incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of the earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured, though reduced in size. This was at Bree, and in the Chetwoods that lay round about, some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write, after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days also they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron, as it was named, that was current, though all the lands of the kings from the Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea from Belfast to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, a legend among the hobbits first becomes history with the reckoning of years, for it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Followhide brothers, Marco and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King of Foremost, they crossed the brown river Barandun with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone bows that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges in the roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new lands, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle, at Foremost, with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. But in that war, the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a Thane, to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of the earth were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had begun to become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. The Hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of the Thane and a district of well-oriented business, and there in that pleasant corner of the world they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians and of the labours of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days, they had of course been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle, before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The Battle of Greenfields, Shire reckoning 1147, in which Bandobras took, routed an invasion of orcs. Even though the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters was now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or walls, or gathered into the museum at Michael's Delving. The Matham House it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called the Mathom. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathoms, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were that sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left these people still, curiously though. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwearingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, fall, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doubly at bay, and at meats could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark, not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the sample diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smears as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages such as Hobbiton or Tuckborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Michael Delving, on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were specifically favoured by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, cartwrights, and others of that sort, for even when they had halls to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. But they were well known to be stores in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No hard-foot or fellow-hide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marsh and of Buckland, east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire up from south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts besides, were derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the high kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at the time at the Grey Havens, away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the western marshes. They shone far off into the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green mount. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and few still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, and the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were, indeed, no more than built imitation of smears, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs and having walls somewhat poached. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses and the halls of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as the friendship with the elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of Graves Mews, or the Brandybucks of Brandyhall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were in any case clannish and reckoned up the relationship with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westermarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, and if they were accurate, they liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. Concerning pipeweed, there is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned. An astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled, through pipes of clay or woods,